In most commercial organizations, if safety is on the board agenda, if the reports are coming in and metrics are reviewed and the dashboards are looking green, then obviously there's a sense that oversight is happening. And yeah, technically it is. But oversight and visibility aren't quite the same thing. Some of the most significant safety failures in corporate history didn't happen in organizations that ignored safety. They actually happened in organizations that believed that they had it under control. And that's the uncomfortable part. It's not usually indifference, it's not recklessness. It's that boards can only govern what they can genuinely see. And what they see is shaped by how information travels upwards. So maybe the better question isn't, is safety reported? But we should be asking, are we really seeing what matters? Because most boards, they receive broadly the same things. They'll receive injury rates and lost time metrics, compliance updates, and RAG dashboards. And they are absolutely all very useful, but they're all mostly backward looking. They tell us what has happened. They don't necessarily tell us where strain might be building. And that's where the lens, well, that shifts slightly. So instead of asking, are we compliant? What if the question became, where might we be becoming a little bit more vulnerable? And yes, that question does feel different, doesn't it? It requires a different depth of visibility. And if reporting doesn't support that depth, reassurance can start to replace insight. Very quietly, with no drama, it's just narrowing. If we think about Boeing and the 737 MAX issue, the issue wasn't an absence of information. It was whether complex technical risk was fully understood at the level where the oversight sat. Engineering decisions, they carried commercial consequences. But if complexity isn't translated upwards enough, then challenge becomes harder. And when challenge becomes harder, visibility reduces. And then when visibility reduces, consequences, they are not going to stay operational. They're going to move into regulatory scrutiny, market confidence, even enterprise value. And that pattern isn't about blame, but it is about how risk is translated and how confidently it's interrogated when it does reach the top. And there's something structural happening too. By the time operational signals reach a board, let's face it, they've been summarized. They've been aggregated and sleuthed, and not in a malicious intent way, but it's just the reality of how large organizations function. In that smoothing process, texture gets lost. Tension becomes more narrative, and narrative becomes headline, and headline becomes dashboards. And dashboards, they are not showing us any friction. So let's think about the role of a board for a moment. Because boards don't run operations, they govern. They govern through judgment and curiosity, and they govern through challenge, which means what gets brought into the boardroom determines how well the board can govern. And this is where that duty of care really shows up in practice. Directors are not just there to receive reports, they're there to ensure that material risk is being genuinely understood. A quiet dashboard doesn't remove that responsibility. If anything, it should really be calling for that deeper curiosity, because absence of bad news, that's not proof of stability. It might simply mean that we're looking in the wrong place. And there's also a question of risk appetite. Now, boards approve risk appetite statements, and they are very, very carefully worded and very well considered. But production pressure and commercial targets and delivery timelines, they're all shaping behavior in real time. And over time, there can be a distance between what's being declared and what's being lived. So occasionally, boards need to pause and they need to ask, is what we believe is happening actually reflected in day-to-day reality? And that's not distrust, that's maturity. I've seen this dynamic play out in real time. In a previous board role, I remember questioning the depth of safety reporting. The reports themselves, they weren't necessarily alarming. They read very well. But I did find myself asking whether they gave us enough texture, whether they had enough insight to understand what might be building beneath the surface. And I very clearly remember that the prevailing view at the time was that quality assurance represented the more pressing governance priority, which commercially, yep, that was understandable. But over the following months, the safety reporting, it was streamlined even further. The agenda time was shortened. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no crisis. But what struck me was how easily visibility can narrow. Again, not through negligence, but through shifting focus. And once visibility narrows, well, curiosity tends to narrow with it. And that experience really reinforced something for me. Strong oversight isn't about reacting to obvious failure. It's about deliberately protecting depth of visibility, even when other issues maybe feel more urgent. Strong oversight isn't about being louder or more forceful. It's usually much, much quieter than that and more deliberate. It shows up in the questions that are asked, in the willingness to perhaps sit with uncertainty for a little bit longer. It's in the decision to test assumptions rather than simply accept reassurance. And strong oversight is often in recognizing something quite straightforward, that safety failures rarely remain contained within operations. They do tend to move outwards into regulatory scrutiny, into reputation, into financial performance. And this, in turn, will affect investor confidence and long-term value. And that makes safety oversight not a compliance topic, but a strategic one. So perhaps the more useful board level question isn't, are we compliant? But we should be asking, do we genuinely understand where risk may be building, even if it isn't obvious yet? Because again, strong oversight isn't about how many reports are being produced. It's about whether they give us real clarity, whether they allow us to go deeper when something doesn't sit quite right, and whether there's enough confidence around the table to ask the slightly uncomfortable questions. And that's usually where you see the difference.